some sketching or free-handed uh, extemporaneous thought um, on the question why the Zizek's thoughts incline towards total error with respect to Heidegger. Um, Basically, there's always a problem that if we force a certain lens onto a question, for instance, say the access problem with the so-called object-oriented ontologists, if you insist that there is an access problem, so that there's, in this sense of primary and secondary qualities, there's this question about, are we really getting to the reality, or are we involved in something like a multiplicity where the dogs are in a dark world of smell and human beings are in various forms of cone induced worlds of colors, some human beings having 3 cones, others on occasion having 4 cones, and therefore a greater radiance of colors, apparently. Since I have 3 cones, I'm not sure whether the 4 cones is actually just more colors or if it's somehow more spectacular on an analogy with color seemingly being preferable to black and white, taking a black and white film as the reference point. If we're stuck in this question of getting to reality understood as the non-relativist primary quality, then we'll always say, no matter what anyone says, that this problem has not been overcome. So, for example, but Heidegger says the problem we can demonstrate from primary phenomenology never can arise, even if it seems to make sense in some shadowy way. It can't arise because when Dasein knows something, say a tree, it's always there in its knowledge alongside the tree. And then if I turn around and I say to myself, tree, and I have this knowledge, as it were, that knowledge is still there in my Dasein, and then I turn around to the so-called external object and it's there again, but just alongside the object, and then say the object is undulating in the wind, making slight movements. This undulation is also right there as an understanding with the object. It's the object. In other words, you could also say it's the object that's doing this thing that we're knowing as undulation. So we're always right there with the object, and therefore if we're in the black and white object, that's something we know, and if we're in the colored object, that's something that we know. And there's no sense in saying one is in positing this notion of the real in terms of the primary qualities and the secondary qualities. So that way of framing the question doesn't seem to be an ultimate and necessary way of speaking. And the more we think about that in connection with how the tradition has been thinking, then we see there's some problems in the way the tradition has been approaching the question. But the problems are problems of not doing phenomenology with enough directness. So when Zizek then says, for Heidegger, Zizek basically, his précis of Heidegger is Heidegger treats history as a transcendental condition for the access to reality. So that's totally false. The way to understand what what Heidegger's doing is trying to gain the most direct phenomenological view of what's happening, and he thinks the Dasein conceptual, beginning first by saying there's always something that has some understanding of being, and the way we want to understand being is Dasein, is a move that claims that the understanding of Dasein is the truth, not that it's only happens to be what we've lighted on because of in our particular moment in the history of metaphysics. So basically, the way Leo Strauss looks at this is by saying Plato begins with a cave, and then there's the second cave on top of that, the cave of history, and then we are taxed with this extra problem that the cave has incited a bunch of graffiti on it now, and some people have hived out certain sections of the cave and said this is not even anymore the cave, but this is the sunlight, and other sections of the cave they've put different signs over and locked certain parts of the cave and so on. And therefore we have even to get back to the place where Plato was at is a long work of working back through, not through every thinker that there ever was, but through the great thinkers who have had, who have directed our thought most decisively, and who continue to direct our thought. So the mission of Heidegger is to, in fact, use history in order to overcome history. And history itself is a historical conception, which, if you look at it just from the Dasein, the claim that we may describe being through this analysis of care or concern, which moves between its knowing and between the entities of its knowing. This is a claim about a non-historical truth. One can then make all kinds of ramifications on questions such as, but how does one want to understand truth, and how is that determined from the ground of existence which one has grown into, and the same with all the basic terms involved. That makes it more difficult, but the basic scientific project of Heidegger is not a transcendental historical claim that we can never reach the final ground. But if truth must be understood as one movement out from Socrates and Plato's question of what is it, where the idea is the answer to the question, what is it, the eidos, or the kind of thing, such that we come into the question of the essence of a thing and the question of genus and differentia, and these questions, which are questions which we can loosely call, from the point of view of Dasein, the sight questions rather than the touch questions. There's two directions: sight, presence at hand, or hand in height; touch, the zu hand in height, where I think the biggest confusion I've gotten into there with my earlier videos was simply that sight and touch are not understood here as questions of access. That's what Heidegger explicitly rules out, and he does that in Being in Time and in other places. We're not talking about sight and touch as access from the suke or soul to the world, because we're already there from the starting point of the Lichtung, in which care, the object of care, and the understanding move, so that touch is only said in order to make a distinction between two entities being set alongside one another, which he doesn't call touch, and Dasein, which has its knowing always there with the object, and which he does, which he says is the only Dasein in that sense, touches. So that it's definitional, where definitional means the thing which orients us towards being. In other words, we know what the words say, so we're oriented properly. So the way Heidegger is presented in Zizek is radically misleading, and in fact it presents Heidegger as something which in a certain way couldn't possibly be appealing to anyone, because it presents Heidegger as though Heidegger were a fixed dead end, which simply announced a kind of radical skepticism in the form of clothed in Kantian transcendental questions of the access of any possible experience.